Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and here I am on Berkeley Square in London. Behind me you can see the house of Clive of India. So who was this person with this curious moniker? Well, he was born in Market Drayton in the United Kingdom in 1725. His father was a solicitor, and so he grew up in a family that was a middle-class family, not that well connected, in Shropshire, which is the West Midlands of England. And rumour has it that he organised a gang of young knuckleheads to go round running a protection racket, so the local shopkeepers had to pay them not to give them hassle. Don't know if that's true or not. Robert Clive certainly attracted a lot of enemies. Anyway, as a teenager he joined the Honourable East India Company. Many people question this adjective honourable for it, that it had been founded in 1600, on New Year's Eve no less, with the Royal Charter. So he sailed to India by way of the Cape in South Africa, a voyage which took about 4 months. And he was there employed as a writer in Calcutta. It's now called Kolkata. A writer is not like a novelist or something of that nature, it's like a clerk. So the East India Company was doing commerce with India, purchasing all sorts of products, shipping them back here, indeed purchasing manufacturers here in the United Kingdom and selling things in India which were not available there, which could not be produced at the time. By the early 18th century, the East India Company had got into real estate. It was not just to buying land for the sake of having warehouses and places for its employees to live, but to agricultural land to charge rent to the tenant farmers and so on, and signing all sorts of agreements with Indian rulers. Now, India was in a state of turmoil at the time. The Mughal Empire, with its capital at Delhi, was declining. It was a Persian-speaking Muslim elite who ruled, but they were losing control over outlying parts of the empire, particularly the Hindu majority regions in the south and the east. So Calcutta, being in Bengal, was in an area which was roughly half Muslim, half Hindu. Anyway, the French were also there. They had their own East India Company, and France and the United Kingdom were often at war in the 18th century. So he was no great shakes as a businessman, Robert Clive. He did do some business on his own account, as in not under the auspices of the East India Company, and that's where the real money was to be made. People actually had to pay to get these jobs in the East India Company. They had to be reasonably well got, because although it was risky with tropical diseases and so on, there was serious dosh to be made. Anyway, he distinguished himself in leading troops against the French. Because the security situation was in such flux, the East India Company had its own army, indeed its own navy. And then sometimes in the fight against the French, the British Army and the Royal Navy were involved as well. But sometimes when the United Kingdom was at peace with various Indian states, the East India Company would still be at war against them. It was the Court of Directors back here in London that was controlling things. That was for major shareholders. There was also the General Court of Proprietors, and anyone who bought shares was in at that level, but they had little say. Anyway, so he fought against the French, won't detail his military campaigns, and he famously retook Kolkata when they're driven out by it, by Suraj ud Dowla. So many of his foes are now held up as Indian nationalists, but this is largely bogus because most of them were in the pocket of the French. So had things gone the other way, India would now be a French-speaking country rather than an English-speaking country, would not have been independent until well into the 20th century. So famously he prevailed in the Battle of Plassey in 1757 up there in Bengal, and there's still an obelisk which commemorates this, largely overlooked now. Surprised that Indian nationalists have not removed it. So then he was ennobled as Lord Clive of Plassey, and now his peerage related to a place in Ireland, in County Clare. There's nowhere called Plassey there, but anyway, peers have to be related to a piece of land. Now the advantage of him getting an Irish peerage, they'd never been to Ireland, is that he could then be elected to the House of Commons of Great Britain, whereas if he was a peer of Great Britain, he would not be allowed to elect to the House of Commons. He'd have an automatic seat in the House of Lords, but for some reason he considered it more advantageous to be elected to the Commons. So with his fortune, he was a multi-millionaire in today's terms, he returned to the United Kingdom, and he was known as a Nabob. This is a mispronunciation of the Muslim Indian title Nawab. So people who were working for John Company, as they nicknamed the East India Company, who made huge fortunes, were sometimes called nabobs. This was often a term of resentment by other politicians who said, oh well, you don't come from blue blood and broad acres, you're a bit of a carpetbagger, and your nouveau riche. You made your cash over in the Far East, South Asia, as we would now say. But anyway, he came back and he was involved in politics here. So he appears to have been bipolar, and then he died in mysterious circumstances in the house behind me. So was it murder? Was it suicide? Some people like Neeraj Singh Chowdhury have said, well, we should simply accept that it was suicide because he was a manic depressive. Like many of those people who can be incredibly energizing and buoyant at times, he could also be down in the dumps. It was a bit like Pitt the Elder or Churchill, someone plagued by the black dog. It's probable that his family wished to cast a pall over the true reason for his death because there was such a stigma around suicide at the time, and those who were self-destroyers were not buried in consecrated ground. So, yeah, then he came back here, and that was the end of him, killing himself at the age of 49. He could have achieved much more had he been made Governor General of India, had he got further in politics here. So, for a couple of centuries, he was adulated here, and the textbooks would speak of him as a model to be emulated. But these days, he's largely overlooked by British textbooks, and he would be execrated by Indians who would see him as a buccaneer, a freebooter, a thug, an exploiter, all the rest of it. So that is the highly controversial Clive of India.